Winter evenings now found Mike and Bear sharing the warmth of the fireplace, the dog's head resting contentedly on his rescuer's lap. Sometimes Mike would think back to that morning in the woods, amazed at how one moment of discovery had led to so much positive change. Bear would look up at him with those knowing eyes, as if to say he'd understood all along that they were meant to find each other. The story of the hunter and the dog tied to a tree had spread far beyond their small community, inspiring other towns to take action against animal abandonment. But for Mike, the greatest reward was much simpler. It was in the wagging tail that greeted him each morning, the loyal friend who walked beside him through the woods, and the knowledge that sometimes the best things in life come from choosing to stop and help when others might have walked away. 3 months had passed since that fateful morning in the woods. The autumn chill had given way to winter's first snowfall, and Mike's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. Bear, now healthy and strong, sat beside him on the front porch of his house, watching snowflakes drift down from the gray December sky. The once frightened dog had transformed into a confident, loving companion. The waiting period at the shelter had come and gone with no one claiming Bear. Deep down, Mike had known from the first day that this dog was meant to be part of his family. His wife had fallen in love with Bear instantly, and their 2 kids treated him like a furry brother. It was as if the dog had always been meant to find his way to their home. "Ready for our walk, buddy?" Mike asked, reaching for the bright orange safety vest that Bear now wore on their outings. The dog's tail wagged enthusiastically at the familiar words. These daily walks had become their special routine, though they avoided that particular part of the woods where they'd first met. Some memories were better left in the past. Bear's recovery had been remarkable. The local vet had treated him for malnutrition and minor injuries, and the community had rallied to cover the medical costs. Now his black coat was glossy and thick, his eyes bright and alert. The only reminder of his ordeal was a slight wariness around strangers that faded once he got to know them. The investigation sparked by Bear's discovery had led to significant changes in the community. The sheriff's department had established a special task force dedicated to preventing animal abuse, and their presence in remote areas had virtually eliminated reports of abandoned pets. The collected evidence, including those tragic collars Mike had found, had helped build a strong case against several suspects. Mike's hunting habits had changed too. He still enjoyed his time in the woods, but now he went with a different purpose. Bear accompanied him on these trips, wearing his orange safety vest and proving to be an excellent companion. The dogs seemed to understand that these walks were different from their first meeting. Now they were about joy and companionship rather than survival. The local animal shelter had seen a surge in support following Bear's story. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their facilities and hire more staff. They'd even started a program named after Bear, providing emergency medical care for rescued animals. The sight of the Bears Fund sign outside the shelter always made Mike smile. The community's response had created lasting change. Local businesses continued their support, with the hardware store still keeping their promise to report suspicious purchases. The pet supply store had started a program to help struggling pet owners with food and basic supplies, preventing desperate situations that might lead to abandonment. One cold morning, Mike found himself back at Mrs. Baker's diner, sitting at his usual spot with a cup of hot coffee. The bulletin board that had once been covered with missing pet photos now displayed success stories, pictures of rescued animals with their new families, thank you notes from grateful pet owners, and updates on community initiatives. "You know what the best part is?" Mrs. Baker asked, sliding a fresh piece of apple pie in front of Mike. "People aren't just talking about it anymore, they're actually doing something. Yesterday, a customer found a stray cat, and instead of just walking by, they brought it straight to the shelter." Bear had become something of a local celebrity, though he remained humble about his fame, as only a dog could. Children would point and wave when they saw him walking down the street, and he always responded with a friendly wag of his tail. He'd even visited local schools as part of their new animal welfare education program, showing kids that even animals who'd had a rough start could become loving pets. Mike's construction co-workers had fully embraced Bear as their unofficial mascot. They'd set up a water bowl and bed for him in the side office, and he spent many happy days supervising their work from his comfortable spot in the shade. His presence seemed to lift everyone's spirits, a living reminder that one small act of kindness could spark meaningful change. The woods where Mike had found Bear had transformed as well. The old oak tree still stood, but now it was marked with a small plaque dedicated to all the animals who'd never made it home. The area had become a symbol of hope rather than despair, with regular patrols ensuring no other animals would suffer there. Local veterinarians had started offering free checkups for rescued animals and reduced rates for people who might be struggling to care for their pets. Sometimes people abandon animals because they feel they have no other choice, one vet explained during a community meeting. We want them to know there are always alternatives, always people willing to help. The movement had grown beyond just finding those responsible for abandoning pets. It had become about preventing such incidents from happening in the first place. Education programs were started in local schools, teaching children about responsible pet ownership and animal welfare. The message was clear: animals were part of the community, and the community would protect them. Through it all, Mike remained grounded, never seeking attention for his role in starting this change. His focus stayed on the practical aspects: teaching volunteers, coordinating with law enforcement, and making sure Bear's story continued to make a difference. The quiet hunter who'd stumbled upon a horrible discovery had helped spark a movement, one that was making their community a safer place for all its residents, both human and animal. The story of Bear's rescue spread like wildfire through the community. What started as a local news report quickly caught the attention of larger media outlets. By the next morning, Mike's phone was buzzing with calls from reporters and animal rights organizations. His quiet life as a construction worker and weekend hunter had suddenly become anything but quiet. The local diner, where Mike usually grabbed his morning coffee, had turned into an unofficial headquarters for the growing community response. The owner, Mrs. Baker, had put up a big bulletin board near the entrance where people could post photos of missing pets and share information. Every morning, more pictures appeared, each one representing a family's hope that their lost pet might still be found. "Never seen anything like it," Mrs. Baker told Mike as she refilled his coffee cup. "But then again, never had a hero in here before." Mike felt his face flush at the word hero. He didn't feel like one. He'd just done what any decent person would do. Still, he couldn't help but notice how the diner had become a gathering place for people sharing their own stories and offering to help. The local animal shelter had organized volunteer search parties to check other remote areas in the county. Mike found himself spending his weekends leading these groups, teaching them how to spot signs of human activity in the woods and identify places someone might use to abandon animals. His hunting skills, which he'd learned from his father years ago, were now being used in a way he'd never imagined. "See how these branches are broken?" he'd explain to the volunteers, pointing out details they might have missed. "And notice how the ground here is packed down more than it should be. These are signs that someone's been here repeatedly." The volunteers, a mix of local residents and people who'd driven in from neighboring counties, listened intently and took notes. Their dedication to the cause was touching. Social media had amplified the story beyond their small community. A local tech-savvy high school student had created a website where people could report suspicious activity and share information about missing pets. The site included a map marking all known dumping locations and tips for keeping pets safe. Within days, it had received thousands of visits and dozens of new reports. The sheriff's department set up a special hotline for tips about suspicious activity. Deputy Wilson had posted officers near known access points to remote areas, and their presence alone seemed to be making a difference. "Reports of missing pets have dropped significantly since we started patrolling," he told Mike during one of their regular update meetings. "Sometimes just letting people know we're watching is enough to prevent crimes." Animal welfare organizations from across the state had gotten involved, offering resources and support. They brought in trail cameras to monitor suspicious areas and worked with local law enforcement to establish a reward fund for information leading to arrests. The organization's expertise helped turn the community's enthusiasm into effective action. Mrs. Chen from Animal Control had become a regular presence at community meetings, sharing her knowledge about pet safety and the importance of microchipping. "What happened to Bear has opened people's eyes," she explained to a packed room at the community center. "But we need to make sure this awareness leads to lasting change." Bear's story had touched something in people's hearts, but it was the community's response that truly made a difference. Local businesses had started offering free pet ID tags and discounted microchipping services. The hardware store had even put up signs warning that they would report suspicious purchases of rope or chains. Small actions perhaps, but they showed how the community was coming together. The investigation continued to expand as more evidence came to light. Each new discovery, each piece of information shared by the public, helped build a clearer picture of what had been happening in their community. The sheriff's department worked methodically, carefully documenting everything and building their case. Mike found himself drawn deeper into the effort to protect local pets. His construction co-workers had embraced the cause, using their lunch breaks to put up flyers and spread the word. Even his boss had gotten involved, offering company trucks to transport supplies for the volunteer search teams. The support was overwhelming and heartening. The story spread quickly through the small community. By early afternoon, the sheriff's office had received several calls from people whose pets had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Each call added another piece to the puzzle, another point on Deputy Wilson's map. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested this had been going on for longer than anyone had realized. Local animal shelter volunteers began arriving, offering help and resources. Someone brought pet food and supplies for Bear. Others offered to put up flyers and spread the word through social media. Mike watched as his community came together, turning his solitary discovery into a movement for change. The support was overwhelming, but it also highlighted how many people had been affected by similar incidents. As the afternoon wore on, Mike found himself becoming more involved in the developing investigation. His knowledge of the local woods proved valuable as they planned searches of other remote areas that might have been used for similar purposes. His morning of hunting had turned into something much bigger than himself, a chance to right a wrong and maybe prevent it from happening again. By the time Mike's truck came into view through the trees, Bear was moving slower but hadn't given up. The sight of the vehicle seemed to give the dog a second wind, as if sensing that help was truly on the way. Mike had already spread an old blanket he kept in his truck across the back seat, preparing a comfortable spot for his newfound friend. Getting Bear into the truck turned out to be easier than expected. Despite his weakened state, the dog managed to climb in with just a little help, settling onto the blanket with what sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Mike pulled out his water bottle and the last pieces of jerky, making sure Bear was comfortable before closing the door. The morning's hunt had turned into something far more important than tracking deer. The drive to the local sheriff's office took about 40 minutes. Every few minutes, Mike would glance in his rearview mirror, checking on Bear, who had curled up on the blanket but kept his eyes fixed on Mike. The trust this animal showed, even after everything it had been through, touched something deep in Mike's heart. The radio played quietly, some old country song about friendship and loyalty that seemed fitting for the moment. 2 patrol cars were waiting when they pulled into the sheriff's office parking lot. Mike had called ahead again when he got better cell service, and word of his discovery had clearly sparked immediate interest. Deputy Wilson, who Mike knew from local community meetings, was already walking toward the truck as they parked. The deputy's face showed genuine concern when he saw Bear's condition. "This is exactly why we need to document everything properly," Deputy Wilson said, carefully approaching the truck's back door. "We've had reports of missing dogs in the county, but nothing concrete to connect them until now." He pulled out a camera and began taking photos of Bear, being careful not to startle the dog. The deputy's gentle handling of the situation made Mike glad he'd called law enforcement first. The animal control officer arrived a few minutes later, a kind-faced woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen. She had been doing this job for 15 years and knew exactly how to approach Bear. "Poor baby," she said softly, offering some treats from her pocket. "Let's get you checked out." Bear accepted the treats cautiously but seemed to sense her good intentions. Mike handed over the collars he'd collected from the clearing, each one now carefully sealed in evidence bags provided by Deputy Wilson. As he laid them out on the hood of the patrol car, the reality of what they represented hit him again. Each collar had belonged to a pet, each one represented a story that needed to be told. The investigation moved quickly after that. Mike found himself sitting in the sheriff's office, describing everything he'd seen while Deputy Wilson took detailed notes. The location, the condition of the rope, the way the collars had been hidden, every detail could be important. As Mike talked, he could hear Mrs. Chen in the next room, making arrangements for Bear to receive immediate veterinary care. "This isn't the first time we've heard about something like this," Deputy Wilson explained, spreading out a map on his desk. "We've had reports of missing pets from several surrounding counties, but nothing solid to work with. Your discovery might be the break we needed." He marked the location Mike had found with a red pin, then showed several other marks on the map where dogs had gone missing over the past year. The local news station arrived while Mike was still giving his statement. He hadn't expected the media attention, but Deputy Wilson explained that publicizing the case might help locate other victims or witnesses. The reporter, a serious-looking woman in her 40s, listened intently as Mike recounted his morning's discovery. He made sure to emphasize the importance of people keeping a close eye on their pets and reporting any suspicious activity. Throughout all of this, Mike kept checking on Bear, who was now resting comfortably in Mrs. Chen's office, wrapped in fresh blankets and waiting for transport to the vet. The dog had been given some water and proper dog food and already seemed more alert. Every time Mike looked in, Bear's tail would wag, as if reassuring him that everything was okay. The forest around them was fully awake now, filled with the sounds of late morning. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was strange how normal everything seemed, how the woods carried on with their usual business, while Mike's world had been completely changed by what he'd discovered. He found himself talking quietly to Bear as they walked, sharing his thoughts about what they'd found and what needed to be done about it. "We're going to make this right," he promised, watching as Bear navigated carefully around a fallen log. "Those other collars, they're going to help us make sure this doesn't happen to any other dogs." Bear looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, as if understanding every word. The dog's resilience amazed Mike. Despite everything it had been through, here it was, walking steadily beside a stranger, choosing to trust again. The walk back to his truck became a journey of small victories, each rest stop where Bear drank water, each obstacle they navigated together, each moment the dog's strength seemed to return a little more. Mike's hunting day hadn't turned out anything like he planned, but as he watched Bear's tail begin to wag more confidently with each passing minute, he knew he ended up exactly where he needed to be. The weight of what he'd discovered settled heavily on Mike's shoulders as he looked down at the phone in his hand. One bar of service wasn't much, but he had to try. The black dog sat patiently beside him, no longer bound by the rope, but choosing to stay close, as if understanding that this human meant safety. The morning had grown warmer, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped out its steady rhythm on a hollow tree. Before making any calls, Mike dug through his hunting vest pockets. He always packed more snacks than he needed, a habit his wife teased him about, but one that was proving useful now. He found a couple of granola bars and a bag of beef jerky. The dog's eyes followed his every movement, its tail giving a tentative wag as Mike unwrapped a granola bar. "Here you go, buddy," Mike said softly, breaking the bar into small pieces. "We need to get some food in you before we start walking." The dog took each piece gently from his hand, chewing carefully as if savoring every morsel. Despite its obvious hunger, there was no aggression, no desperate grabbing for food. This was definitely someone's pet, trained and well-loved at some point before ending up here. As the dog ate, Mike studied the tag he found earlier on its collar. Wiping away more dirt with his thumb revealed a name. Bear. He tried the name out loud, and the dog's ears perked up immediately. "So that's your name, huh? Bear." The dog's tail wagged harder, and it pressed closer to Mike's leg. Something about knowing the dog's name made the situation feel even more personal, more real. Mike pulled out his phone again, hoping the signal hadn't dropped. He had to make several calls, but which one first? Animal control? The sheriff's department? As he pondered this, Bear suddenly stiffened beside him, ears alert. Mike had learned to trust animals' instincts over his years of hunting, so he immediately fell silent and listened. After a moment, he'd heard what had caught Bear's attention, the distant sound of a vehicle on the old logging road. A mixture of anger and alertness surged through Mike. Was someone coming back to this spot? He quickly gathered the collars he found, stuffing them into his vest pockets as evidence. Then he snapped a few final photos of the scene with his phone, making sure to get clear shots of the rope and the tree. Bear stayed close, pressing against his leg as if seeking reassurance. The sound of the vehicle faded, probably just someone using the logging road as a shortcut, as locals often did. Still, Mike knew they needed to get moving. He was worried about Bear's condition, and they had a fair walk ahead of them to reach his truck. He parked about a mile away, near his usual hunting spot, never expecting to end up here. "Okay, Bear," Mike said, gathering his gear. "Think you can walk a little way with me?" As if understanding perfectly, Bear stood up, still staying close to Mike's side. Despite his weakened condition, the dog seemed determined to follow his rescuer. Mike scratched behind Bear's ears, noticing how the dog leaned into his touch, trusting him already. The walk back would take longer than usual. Mike knew he'd have to go slowly, letting Bear rest when needed. He still had some water in his canteen, which he'd need to share with the dog. As they started walking, Mike pulled out his phone once more, this time getting through to the local sheriff's office despite the weak signal. He kept his voice low and calm as he explained what he'd found, not wanting to upset Bear with any agitation in his tone. The dispatcher on the other end took his information carefully, asking him to repeat the details about the location several times to make sure they got it right. Mike described the old logging road, the distinctive split oak tree, and the clearing. He mentioned the collars he'd found and watched as Bear's ears twitched at the serious tone in his voice. As they walked, Mike kept a careful eye on Bear's condition. The dog was weak but determined, matching his pace and stopping when he stopped. Every so often, Mike would offer more water or small pieces of jerky, encouraging Bear with soft words. The dog's trust in him seemed to grow with each step, each small kindness erasing a little bit of the fear and uncertainty from those expressive eyes. As Mike finally managed to work the knot loose, he found himself looking more carefully at his surroundings, trying to memorize every detail. The distinctive split in the old oak's trunk, the way the clearing was shaped, the pattern of younger trees around the edge. He needed to be able to find this place again, to show others what he found. The dog, feeling the rope loosen, pressed closer to him, no longer bound to the tree but choosing to stay near its rescuer. Mike pulled out his phone, glad he kept it with him for emergencies. The screen showed only 1 bar of service, barely enough, but it would have to do. Before making any calls, he carefully photographed everything. The tree, the rope, the scattered collars, taking care to include landmarks in the background that would help identify the location. Each click of the camera felt like documenting evidence of something much darker than he ever expected to find on a routine hunting morning. The black dog watched him work, staying close as if afraid he might disappear. Now free from the rope, it had opportunities to run, but instead chose to stick by Mike's side. Perhaps it somehow understood that its discovery had unveiled something bigger than itself, a mystery that would need to be unraveled, a wrong that would need to be made right. With the dog now trusting him enough to allow touch, Mike began the careful process of examining the rope to figure out how to free the animal. The morning sun had risen higher, casting dappled shadows through the leaves above, and the woods around them had settled into its usual quiet rhythm of birdsong and rustling leaves. As Mike worked, he kept up a gentle stream of reassuring words, more for the comfort they seemed to give the dog than any real need to speak. The rope was tied frustratingly tight, and Mike had to be careful not to pull or tug in a way that might hurt the dog. He wished he'd brought his hunting knife, which was sitting uselessly in his truck's glove compartment. Instead, he had to make do with the small multi-tool he kept in his vest pocket. As he worked to loosen the knot, his fingers brushed against something metal on the dog's collar, a tag that had been hidden under the matted fur. Curious, Mike gently turned the tag over. It was badly scratched, but he could just make out what looked like a phone number. His heart lifted for a moment. Maybe this would be an easy fix, just a call to worried owners who'd been searching for their lost pet. But as he cleared away more fur from the collar, he realized the tag was much older than the rope. The phone number had an area code he hadn't seen used in years. That's when Mike noticed something odd about the ground around the tree. Fall leaves had blown into small piles here and there, but one pile behind the tree trunk seemed different somehow. It was more deliberate, almost like someone had kicked leaves over something they wanted to hide. 20 years of hunting had taught Mike to notice when things in nature didn't look quite right, and this definitely didn't look right. Still keeping one hand on the dog's neck to reassure it, Mike leaned over and brushed away some of the leaves with his free hand. What he found made his blood run cold. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small red collar. It wasn't the dog's collar. This one was much too small, maybe meant for a puppy or a cat. Heart pounding, Mike brushed away more leaves. Another collar emerged from beneath the fallen foliage, this one blue with a little bell still attached. Then another and another. Mike's hands began to shake as he uncovered collar after collar, each one telling its own silent story of abandonment. Some were worn and weathered, clearly having been there for months. Others looked newer, their bright colors standing out starkly against the dark earth. The dog whined softly, picking up on Mike's distress. He forced himself to take a deep breath, to keep his movements calm and steady for the animal's sake. But his mind was racing. This wasn't just about one abandoned dog anymore. This spot, this old oak tree in the middle of nowhere, had been used before. Multiple times. The reality of what he was seeing hit him like a physical blow. Someone had been using this remote location as a dumping ground. They'd chosen it carefully, far enough from any trails that casual hikers wouldn't stumble across it, but not so far that they couldn't easily drive nearby. The thought of how many animals had been left here, tied to this same tree, made Mike's stomach turn. How many had been as lucky as this black dog, found before it was too late? How many hadn't been so fortunate? The dog pressed against his leg, seeking comfort, and Mike realized his hands had stopped working on the rope. He forced himself to focus on the immediate task. Free this dog first, then deal with the larger implications of what he'd discovered. But as he returned to working on the knot, his mind couldn't help but piece things together. The location was perfect for someone who didn't want to be seen. Accessible by the old logging road about a quarter-mile back, but invisible from any main trails. The rope around the dog's neck was new, probably only a few days old, but some of these collars had clearly been here for months, maybe even longer. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern. When Mike was finally within arm's reach, he kept up his quiet monologue, letting the dog get used to his presence. "You're being so brave, buddy. Such a good dog." He slowly reached out his hand, palm up, letting the dog make the choice to approach or not. After what felt like an eternity, he felt a cold nose gently touch his fingers. That small touch was like a dam breaking. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, and it took a small step forward, pressing its head into Mike's hand. The fur was rough and tangled under his fingers, but the trust being shown nearly brought tears to his eyes. This close, he could see that under the dirt and fear, this was a beautiful animal, probably a lab mix of some kind, with a broad, gentle face and intelligent eyes. As Mike began to gently examine the rope around the dog's neck, looking for the best way to free it, his mind was already racing with questions. Who would do this? Why here, in such a remote spot? Had they really thought no one would find this poor animal? But more importantly, what was he going to do next? His quiet morning of hunting had turned into something much more significant, and somehow he knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. Mike took slow, careful steps into the clearing, keeping his movements steady and deliberate. Years of approaching wild animals had taught him the importance of staying calm and non-threatening. The black dog watched his every move, its head slightly lowered but eyes never leaving him. There was something about those eyes that spoke of intelligence and past kindness. This wasn't a wild animal, but a pet that someone had betrayed. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays cutting through the tree branches and illuminating the scene in patches of light and shadow. As Mike got closer, his heart sank even further. The dog's condition was worse than he'd first thought. Its black fur, which should have been shiny and thick, was matted with dirt and burrs. In some places, it was so tangled that it had formed thick clumps that must have been painful for the poor animal. Despite his gentle approach, Mike could see the dog's muscles tensing. He stopped about 10 feet away and slowly knelt down, making himself smaller and less threatening. From his hunting pack, he pulled out the sandwich he'd packed for lunch. Turkey on whole wheat, nothing fancy, but food was food. The dog's nose twitched at the smell, and Mike saw the first real change in its demeanor, a slight lift of its ears, a tiny shift forward. "Hey there, buddy," Mike said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept his tone even and gentle, the way he talked to his nephew's nervous puppy. "You must be hungry, huh?" He pulled off a small piece of turkey and tossed it gently toward the dog, making sure it landed well within reach of the rope. The dog looked at the meat, then back at Mike, then at the meat again. Its tail, which had been tucked tightly against its body, gave the smallest of twitches. Slowly, with obvious caution, it stretched forward and sniffed the offering. After a moment's hesitation, the piece of turkey disappeared in one quick bite. Encouraged by this small success, Mike continued the careful process of building trust. One small piece of turkey at a time, each toss accompanied by soft words of encouragement. With each successful interaction, he could see tiny changes in the dog's body language, its ears perking up a bit more, its tail loosening from its tight curl, its eyes showing less fear and more interest. As he worked to gain the dog's trust, Mike took the opportunity to really study the situation. The rope around the dog's neck wasn't some flimsy piece of twine. It was a proper nylon rope, the kind you buy at a hardware store. The knot holding it to the tree was complex and deliberate, tied by someone who knew what they were doing. This wasn't a case of a dog accidentally getting tangled up. Someone had intentionally left this animal here. The ground around the tree told its own story. There was a worn circular path where the dog had paced the limits of its rope, probably for days. An overturned plastic bowl lay just out of reach, cruel evidence that someone had left water at some point, but hadn't bothered to place it where the dog could actually drink from it. The whole scene spoke of calculated abandonment rather than a simple act of thoughtlessness. After about 15 minutes of patient feeding and talking, the dog had eaten most of Mike's sandwich and had stopped flinching at the sound of his voice. He decided it was time to try moving closer. Still keeping his movements slow and predictable, he shifted forward on his knees, just a few inches at a time. The dog watched him carefully but didn't show any signs of aggression. As he got closer, Mike could see more details that make his heart ache. The dog's collar was a store-bought one, faded but still functional, suggesting it had once had a proper home. There were small burrs and thorns stuck in its paw pads, evidence of a desperate struggle to break free at some point. Despite all this, there was still a gentleness in the dog's eyes that spoke of an unbroken spirit. The dog lifted its head as Mike entered the clearing, and their eyes met. In all his years in the woods, Mike had never seen such a look in an animal's eyes. There was fear there, yes, but also something else. Something that spoke of betrayal and lost trust. The dog didn't bark or growl, just watched him with those intense eyes that seemed to hold a world of sadness. Mike's hands tightened on his rifle strap. His morning of hunting was forgotten now. The deer trail, the perfect weather, all of it pushed aside by what he was seeing. The clearing was silent except for the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze and the soft jingle of the dog's collar as it shifted slightly. He knew right then that his day had taken a very different turn from what he planned. But he had no idea just how much this moment would change not only his life, but the lives of many others. As he took his first careful step into the clearing, the true gravity of what he was about to discover was still unknown to him. The crisp autumn morning wrapped around Mike like a familiar blanket as he made his way through the dense Missouri woods. He'd been doing this for 20 years now, every hunting season, rain or shine. The familiar weight of his orange vest and the trusty rifle slung across his shoulder felt like old friends. The woods were quiet except for the soft crunch of leaves under his boots and the occasional bird call overhead. Mike had gotten up well before sunrise, just like his dad had taught him years ago. The early hunter catches more than just worms, his father used to say with a wink. Now, with the sun slowly climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, Mike was tracking what looked like promising deer signs. He'd spotted fresh tracks near a creek about half an hour ago, and the broken twigs along the trail told him he was on the right path. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and the air had that special kind of freshness you can only find in the woods. Mike loved these quiet moments, just him and nature, away from his job at the construction site and all the noise of everyday life. He'd turned off his phone, just keeping it for emergencies. Out here, it was just him and the ancient rhythm of the forest. As he carefully stepped over a fallen log, something caught his attention. At first, it was so faint he thought he might have imagined it. Mike froze mid-step, the way only experienced hunters know how to do. There it was again. A sound that didn't belong among the usual morning forest chorus. A whimper, weak but distinct, carried on the light breeze. 20 years of hunting had taught Mike to know every sound these woods could make. He knew the difference between a raccoon rustling through fallen leaves and a deer carefully picking its way through the underbrush. He could tell a fox's bark from a coyote's at any distance. But this sound, this was different. It tugged at something in his chest, making him forget all about the deer trail he'd been following. Mike stood perfectly still, turning his head slowly to pinpoint the direction of the sound. There it was again, coming from somewhere off to his right. The sound was weak, but there was something in it that made his heart beat faster. It wasn't the cry of a wild animal. There was something almost human about it, something that spoke of pain and loneliness. Carefully, he began moving toward the sound, his hunting boots finding silent purchase on the forest floor. The thick underbrush pulled at his clothes as he pushed through, but he barely noticed. The whimpering was getting clearer now, guiding him like a compass needle pointing true north. The brush got thicker, and Mike had to use his free hand to push aside branches and thorny vines. His hunting instincts told him to move quietly, even though he was pretty sure he wasn't tracking any wild animal now. The morning sun was climbing higher, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy above, creating patches of brightness in the forest gloom. After about 10 minutes of careful movement, the undergrowth began to thin out. Mike could see a clearing ahead through the trees. The whimpering had stopped, but something told him he was in the right place. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the middle of the small clearing, stood an old oak tree. Its massive trunk and spreading branches would normally have been a beautiful sight, the kind of tree that had probably stood watch over these woods for hundreds of years. But what Mike saw tied to that tree made his stomach turn. A large black dog was tethered to the trunk, its rope so short it could barely lie down. The morning light revealed every detail of the scene with harsh clarity. The way the dog's ribs showed through its dull matted fur, the packed-down earth in the small circle where it had paced, and the empty water bowl knocked over nearby. Mike had seen a lot of things in his years of hunting: injured animals, abandoned camps, even the aftermath of forest fires. But something about this scene felt different. This wasn't nature's harsh way. This was human cruelty, deliberate and calculated. The rope wasn't some old piece of twine that might have tangled up an animal by accident. It was a proper rope, tied with purpose.